Well, thanks everyone for coming out this evening. As Aaron mentioned, Preston and I are both on the 150th anniversary committee here at St. Paul's, and due to our mutual interest and appreciation for history, we've really enjoyed helping out with the historical aspects of the celebration this year. At our 150th meetings, discussion is not always strictly focused on what we are doing to celebrate in 2021. Our conversations often turn toward remembering facts and stories of St. Paul's long life here in Sellersville. And because our family has a long history of attendance here, we're often able to contribute some tidbit of information or short story in regard to whatever the particular topic has been on a particular evening. So not long after one of our meetings, Karen Weichel approached us and she said that she and Pastor Trudy had this idea that Preston and I should do some sort of presentation about our family's time here at St. Paul's. And this evening is what became of that some sort of presentation. So if you really enjoyed tonight, you can thank Pastor Trudy and Karen. And if you do not, please talk to Pastor Trudy and Karen. But in all seriousness, Preston and I have had a lot of fun over the past couple of months putting this together, and we hope that you enjoyed this evening. We have some stories that we hope you'll find entertaining. So, you know us, or some of you know us, and not all of you, but hopefully you will by the end of this evening. You know us as the Ziegenfuss family. But the Ziegenfuss family, as you know it today, descends from several families with a long-standing history within St. Paul's. Directly related names that you'll hear this evening include Ruth, my mom's family's name, and Cooker, the maternal side of my dad's family. Our family tree is a bit convoluted, and there are several other family names you'll hear mentioned, including Gilkison and McClary, my dad's half-siblings through his mother's first marriage, and Wolf, Stoneback, and Tice, all related names through marriages.
Relative that we can trace back to is Balthasar Ziegenfuss, who was born in Germany sometime around 1575. Balthasar's great-great-grandson, Hans Jacob Ziegenfuss, along with his family, moved from Germany in 1738, arriving in Philadelphia on October 28th aboard the Belander Thistle, a sketch of which, if this works, is up on the screen. As far as we know, they immediately moved to the Bedminster area of Upper Bucks County, and several of our early Ziegenfuss ancestors are buried at St. Peter's Tohickon Church. 3 years later, George Ruth and his wife also moved from Germany, arriving in Philadelphia on September 23, 1741, aboard the ship Marlborough. They moved to Springfield Township, the Springfield Township area in Upper Bucks County, and up on the screen we have some documents that we came across, a copy of the ship's log with George Ruth's signature, in addition to the oath of allegiance he signed to King George II of England. After our family's brave and arduous journeys around the world, their descendants, nearly 300 years later, have moved as far as Sellersville, Blooming Glen, and Telford, all also in Upper Bucks County.
So the first record we have of our family living in Sellersville is on the Cooker side of the family. My grandmother, Catherine Ziegenfuss's family. And this is a picture of that family. That's my grandmother in the center, or the back there, and those are her parents. Her father, Jacob A. Cooker, was born in Sellersville in 1864. His mother was Elizabeth Allebach Cooker, who died in 1865, a year after Jacob's birth. So we don't have a lot to say about Elizabeth, but we came across, this is a picture of her. So she died in 1865. We just thought that was pretty cool that we were able to find a picture of her. And it was actually labeled that that's who that was. Jacob's father was Enos Cooker, one of the signers of the 1874 petition, which incorporated Sellersville as a borough, and also served on Sellersville's first school board, which was responsible for building the first school building, what is now home to the Sellersville Museum. And that's what the school looked like at first. And I know Tim Huffnagel's here somewhere. Thanks, Tim. We've borrowed several images from Tim's 275th anniversary of Sellersville book, and that's one of the photos. And then here is the Cooker home on Main Street. Enos and his family resided in what is now the American Legion building on Main Street in downtown Sellersville. This house was also known for years as the Moose Home, having been owned by the local Loyal Order of the Moose Lodge. And there's a picture of what it looks like today. but I'm going to ask Preston to put it back to the other one because I think that picture is much cooler. Enos Cooker started a hay supply yard at Church and Main Streets, which eventually expanded to sell flour, feed, coal, seeds, and other goods, which was handed over to his son Jacob in 1889. Jacob Cooker ran the business from 1889 until 1926, when he retired and sold the business off. The Cooker family was of the Mennonite tradition. Jacob's maternal grandfather was the Reverend John Allebach, pastor for 53 years of Rock Hill Mennonite Church in what is now West Rock Hill Township, his pastorate only ending upon his passing at the age of 97. So Pastor Trudy, I think we can expect a good 30, 40 years out of you yet, so if you live to that expectation. Despite their family ties, the Cookers were not meant to stay Mennonite. Family lore has it that Jacob was kicked out of the Mennonite church for purchasing an insurance policy of some sort. We do not know the timing of this, but based on documents we have come across in our church archive here at St. Paul's, we believe the Cookers started attending the more liberal-minded St. Paul's Reformed Church sometime in the early 1900s. It's possible that they began attending sometime between the years of 1899 and 1903, this time period encompassing the pastorate of Reverend George Greenewald at St. Paul's. Mary Cooker, Mary Cooker, Jacob's wife, was a lifelong friend of Matilda Greenewald, Reverend Greenewald's wife. It is likely that their friendship began during the Reverend Greenewald's time at St. Paul's. Mary and Matilda maintained a written correspondence with each other until the 1940s, and Matilda was a frequent guest at the Cookers' High Street home on her return visits to Sellersville and years later. Despite his difficulties with the Mennonite Church, Jacob was an influential businessman and civic leader. He ran one of Sellersville's most prominent businesses for nearly 40 years, part of which included selling St. Paul's much of its coal in its early years. He was a Sellersville Borough Councilman for 26 years, after which he served as Chief Burgess of Sellersville, what we now call Mayor, for 14 years. He was president of the Sellersville Building and Loan Association and president of the Sellersville Progressive Real Estate Company. He, along with one of my maternal great-grandfathers, Preston Ruth, and St. Paul's Reverend James Shepley, was a charter member of the Sellersville Kiwanis Club. Jacob and Mary Cooker's only child was their daughter, Catherine, born on Jacob's 30th birthday, February 4th, 1894. Continuing to connect the dots for everyone, Catherine is my grandmother, my dad's mother. She was confirmed at St. Paul's in 1911. Also in her confirmation class here at St. Paul's was Howard Gilkison, her first husband, who she married in 1915. And here that's a picture of Howard Gilkison, and that is a picture of my grandmother in her wedding dress for her first wedding in 1915. The Gilkison family had a business near St. Michael's known as the Sellersville Monumental Works that made tombstones and monuments, and which was across the street from Jacob Cooker's supply yard. So this is a zoom in of the earlier photo. So that's St. Michael's in the background, of course, and at the base of the hill there you can see those white things are tombstones, and there was a business there that sold tombstones. That was the Gilkison family business. The 1910s were an exciting time for this confirmation class couple. Howard attended West Point Military Academy, graduating in 1915 in what became known as the class the stars fell on, alongside peers including Dwight Eisenhower and Omar Bradley. And Howard Gilkison is in the red square there on the photo on the screen. And if you're interested later on, Preston can point out which one is Dwight Eisenhower. Howard's military career took him all over the country, including to the Mexican border, where he and Catherine avoided gunfire from Pancho Villa's insurgents. And again, some interesting things we found recently while we were preparing for tonight was we found some pictures from that time of the U.S.-Mexican border as it was in those days. Might be interested for the congressman. That was the fence in those days. And on the pictures, it was written United States and Mexico. You can't quite make it out in that picture, but that is a sentry guard at the border there. And I think this is circa 1916 or 18. His career took an adventurous turn when he became among the first U.S. Army aviators. And here are some photos we found. We don't know if he took these pictures or if these were pictures taken of him, but we found pictures of his early days in aircraft during his military career. And that is Howard Gilkison in the cockpit of an airplane. Howard and Catherine's first son, Robert, my Uncle Bob, was born in 1918. Howard made news in town here by flying an airplane to Sellersville to meet his new son at Grandview Hospital. Their daughter, Mary, was born 2 years later in 1920. Dr. C.D. Fretz, a charter member of St. Paul's in 1871 and a longtime consistory man, delivered Mary. And here we have a picture, and this is in the room next door. You can look at afterwards. We actually found the hospital bill for, I think it's $55.74 for 1 week and 6 days of a hospital stay for the birth of my Aunt Mary. As far as we know, Catherine remained in Sellersville with her parents once children were in the picture. The adventurous and sometimes lavish partying lifestyle of a military officer did not mesh well with Catherine's mother, Mary Cooker's Mennonite upbringing, causing stress to the marriage. We do not know the details, but Catherine and Howard divorced sometime in the 1920s, which we can only imagine was somewhat scandalous in small-town Sellersville. Howard Gilkison went on to become a brigadier general and held several notable commands during World War II, commanding the Panama Canal Zone for a time and leading the U.S. Army Air Corps fighter divisions in the Pacific Theater. After the war, he remained in the military, transferring from the Army to the newly formed Air Force, from which he retired in 1951. According to family tales, he was an occasional guest at the White House during the 1950s, having been invited to play cards with his West Point classmate, President Eisenhower. General Gilkison passed away in 1959 and is buried in Arlington National Cemetery.
So we don't know exactly when the Ziegenfuss side of our family moved to Sellersville. There are local newspaper ads from the 1880s onward for the many business ventures of Peter R. Ziegenfuss Jr., my great-great-great-grandfather, who lived from 1847 to 1922. In addition to he had a farm just north of Sellersville, bordering on the east side of what is now Bethlehem Pike, and his property is outlined in red there on the map on the screen, so you can see his property just overlapped with the north of Sellersville. In addition to farming, he also sold fine German carp and castrated animals of all sorts. Here we have a business card that Jim Krastina had sent a picture of us from the museum several years ago advertising Peter Ziegenfuss's castrating business. In addition to a newspaper clipping that we came across advertising his fine carp ponds, making him the salesman of Everglip sliding casters, which were pieces of plate steel that went under furniture to slide across carpet, and advertising his cure-all Ziegenfuss hoof ointment, which evidently was quite useful in his mind at least. In addition to these things, other business ventures included hotel proprietorship. One of the hotels which he was the proprietor of, he actually had built in 1904. It's pictured here under construction and then completed in this image here. And this building made news in Sellersville in 1981 when it began to collapse onto Main Street, Sellersville, which is pictured here. Today, a park and town clock stand where the building once did. Peter Ziegenfuss had 8 children, one of which was Albert Ziegenfuss Sr., my great-great-grandfather, and the first member of the Ziegenfuss family to attend St. Paul's as far as we know. Albert Sr. was a cigar maker by trade and later worked as an assembler at the U.S. Gauge. Albert and his wife Annie, pictured up on the screen, had 4 children together. Albert Jr., who was my great-grandfather, his brother Walter Ziegenfuss, Florence, who some of you may remember because she would marry Raymond Wolfe, who was the father of Shirley Wolfe, and Anna, who would marry Lee Stoneback. All 4 of the Ziegenfuss children were confirmed here at St. Paul's during the 1910s, and at some point, Annie's parents, the Hettenbachs, there's There's Mrs. Hettenbach, and come on. Okay, well, he was there too. So they also began attending St. Paul's with the family. It must have been difficult to be a family of 6 on a cigar maker's earnings, and thus Albert Jr., the oldest child, stopped formal schooling after the 8th grade to go to work to help support the family. And up here we have a picture of Albert Jr.'s class in the very early 1900s, before he dropped out of school, standing right in front of what is the Teller Mill building in Sellersville, right across from the train tracks. The last branch of our family to move to Sellersville is the Ruth family. Preston Ruth, pictured up on the screen, and Annie Ruth moved their family from Quakertown to Sellersville sometime in the early 1910s. Preston had been appointed the manager of the American store, Sellersville's grocery store located on Main Street, after working previously at the North Wales branch of the store owned by the James Bell Company. So up on the screen, Preston Ruth is the man standing, sorry for my shaky hand, but standing there on the right, and that building is still standing on Main Street, Sellersville. And here I think we have 2 more pictures. In this one, this is the interior of the store. There he is on the far right, and one more where he is standing there in the middle. Preston Ruth worked at the American store until 1947 as its manager when he retired. His wife Annie's maiden name was Fetter, and we do not know much about her family, but we believe that they lived in Percy. Preston and Annie had 2 children when they moved to Sellersville: Janice, who was born in 1902, and Lamar, my great-grandfather, who's hopefully coming up, there we go, who was born in 1905. From what we can tell, the family quickly began attending and became quite involved with St. Paul's. Janice and Lamar were both confirmed at St. Paul's in the 1910s. Janice was, at some point, and we're not quite sure when, St. Paul's organist. She was a graduate of Grandview Hospital's nurses' school. She married a Sellersville native, Howard Tice. Howard was actually the older half-brother of Jimmy France and his siblings. He was confirmed here at St. Paul's in 1912. He served in the army during World War I, seeing heavy combat in the trenches of France. In the 1920s, he was the financial auditor of St. Paul's books, while his father-in-law, Preston, was the financial secretary. Janice and Howard did not stay in Sellersville because Howard worked for the Philadelphia Stock Exchange. Sadly, they lost their home when the stock market crashed in 1929. Although Howard continued to work for the stock exchange, he never invested in stocks again and always rented houses from that time on. Despite those early financial troubles, he was always a strong believer in tithing, saying that God would always provide for those who did so. Janice passed away in 1973, but Howard continued to work at the stock exchange into his 80s, retiring only when computers hit the scene. He moved back to Sellersville and resumed regular attendance at St. Paul's until he passed away in 1986. Preston Ruth joined consistory at St. Paul's, becoming a deacon in 1924 and an elder in 1933, and he served in that capacity until at least 1954, when Reverend Bill Meyer presented him with a wristwatch from present and former consistory men in honor of his service, and we have a picture of that presentation up on the screen. Preston was an active leader of the church, serving for many years as the church's financial secretary. For years, he also purchased the grape juice for communion services and helped prepare for those services. When my dad was a kid, and there were still a number of people around church who remembered Preston well, they would tell him that he was the Jimmy France of the church before Jimmy France.
So our family's participation in St. Paul's life was aided by their family home's close location within walking distance to the church here on Green Street. After renting several different houses in Sellersville, including one at the bottom of the hill here at Main and Green Streets, Preston Ruth had a house built at 63 Temple Avenue, which is directly behind our church building. Preston's son Lamar, my grandfather, lived there from the time it was built around 1923 until he passed away in 1984. His wife, Minnie, my grandmother, continued to live there until she sold the home in the 1990s. While there were many conveniences regarding the close proximity of the house to the church, there were a couple of drawbacks. Chief among these were the occasions when the vehicles of the minister's sons ended up in their backyard. The first occurrence of this was when Reverend Bill Meyer's son Citroen made its way from the alley behind the church down into their backyard. At the time, the landscaping of the property allowed for him to drive the car between the houses and down to Temple Avenue for an easy remedy. Phil Schmidt did not have it so easy when he pushed his pickup truck out of the parsonage garage, and his girlfriend, who was in the cab, got the clutch and brake pedals mixed up, allowing the truck to coast across the alley, through Grammy's meticulously trimmed hedge, landing on top of her now broken down grape arbor and vine that had been a part of her proud backyard for many, many years. We, my brother and mom and others, were at home getting dressed to take her out to a restaurant because it was her birthday, when she called on the phone quite distressed, saying that the minister's son's truck was in the middle of her backyard. And we walked out the alley, and sure enough it was. The landscaping had changed significantly since the earlier similar occurrence, and it was quite a challenge to return Phil's truck to the alley. The drop-off from the alley to the yard is too steep to drive up, so going back the way it came through was not an option. With hedges and a shed, driving between the houses like was done years before was not an option without considerably more damage to the obstacles in the truck. Eventually, Phil was able to back the truck off the grape arbor, drive through Grammy's yard and the top of her neighbor's yard, and with the use of some planks, drive the truck up onto the parking spot of the neighbors had at the end of the alley. We're not sure what kind of praying may have taken place at the Schmidt home in the parsonage that night, but we do know that Grammy certainly let them know that she was not pleased with what had happened. At a slightly safer distance from the parsonage, but still close by, the Cooker Ziegenfuss family has resided at 121 High Street since 1927. Now, you'll remember earlier we had the picture of the Moose home down on Main Street, so think about that for a moment. After living in that same home for 56 years, Jacob Cooker sold his home to the Loyal Order of the Moose in 1920 and bought a home at Church and Main Streets directly across from his hay, feed, and coal business. And that's the picture of the home there on the screen, right in the middle of the picture. That's at the base of Church, and it's looking up Main Street, and that's Church Street coming down there, and where the cars parked on the right hand was where his business was at the hay and feed. Just 6 years later, after they had bought that home, it was decided to realign Main Street and build a bridge over the railroad tracks to remove the dangerous crossing. A victim of the realignment was the home where Jacob, his wife Mary, and their daughter Catherine and her children Bob and Mary Gilkison lived. And again, that's the picture on the right-hand side of the picture, or right-hand side of the screen, looking north on Main Street to where the crossing was that was the cause of lots of problems in town with the train traffic in those days. The house was taken by eminent domain, and today's Main Street in front of St. Michael's runs directly over where the house once stood. So that's what it looks like today. It was at this time that the family moved to the High Street home, which was then about 2 years old. And for those of you who aren't familiar, that's if you go out Green Street straight ahead, that's the home straight ahead. That house was built, the house was about 2 years old when they moved in, and it had been built and previously owned by Professor R.M. Freed, a St. Paul's consistory man. This house was Donald Ziegenfuss's home for his entire life, and so far it is his oldest son Peter's lifelong home. Mary Ziegenfuss has resided there since 1963, when she moved all the way from 63 Temple Avenue, right behind the church. Thus, she has lived within a block of St. Paul's for almost 80 years.
I'll preface these two pictures quick and then jump into it. So we found some images of Jacob Cooker's first automobile. This is a 1915 Oakland touring car, and this picture was taken behind the Moose home. You can't really see it, but Mr. Cooker is sitting in the vehicle there. And here is another picture with Mr. and Mrs. Cooker standing in front of their first car. At some point in the 1920s, Jacob Cooker hired Walter Ziegenfuss to be his driver. Hiring a driver was not a luxury for the Cooker family, but rather a matter of safety for Jacob and the community at large. It's, as the saying goes, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. Jacob Cooker was a horseman and never quite grasped the operation of automobiles. Whereas horses have eyes and some sense of their surroundings, obviously cars do not. and it is imperative for operators to be fully aware of all surroundings and have no expectation that the car will stop or avoid objects in its path on its own. We found some brief newspaper clippings indicating that Jacob was in quite a few accidents with his car. It, however, wasn't just while driving cars that he encountered trouble with them. He was also struck by a car in 1924 while attempting to cross the street, and this made headlines in the Percy Central News the next day. And I'll read an excerpt from the article that goes with that headline. While crossing the street near his home on Main Street, J.A. Cooker received a broken leg when an automobile driven by D. Levitt, a furniture salesman of Philadelphia, struck him. Mr. Cooker was returning from the Kiwanis dinner at the Washington House. He was struck with great force and thrown to the ground. By the use of a chair, he was taken to his home. Upon examination by his physician, it was discovered that it was a serious fracture and his removal to Grandview Hospital was ordered. Now, family lore says that he saw the car approaching but stepped into the street anyway, expecting it to stop or go around him the way a horse or horse and buggy would have done for the majority of his 60 years. When he had finally recovered enough to be able to leave his house, 8 months later, his first trip out was to go to church here at St. Paul's for a Sunday service.
And we know that because we found that in the newspaper too.
We do not know how long Walter Ziegenfuss drove for the Cookers, but at some point his older brother Albert took over the driving duties. Presumably, all parties knew each other through their membership at St. Paul's as well as other small-town gatherings. Details leading up to the event are very sparse, but what we do know is that Catherine Cooker Gilkison married Albert Ziegenfuss Jr. on Thursday, April 26, 1928. Presumably, Reverend Shepley presided, and Albert moved in with the Cookers, Catherine, and her 2 children at the High Street home at the end of the street here. And that is a picture of their wedding announcement. By this time, Albert, age 26, was already very involved with the life of St. Paul's. He had become a printer by trade, working locally at the Poultry Item, a picture of which is up on the screen. The Poultry Item was a nationally distributed magazine for poultry farmers, which was apparently a big thing in the U.S. back in the 1920s. It was printed and published right here in downtown Sellersville in a building near the current Sellersville Theater. When St. Paul's began distributing a weekly bulletin in 1930, Albert helped print the leaflet along with other members of his Sunday school class with the permission of Item Publishing Company president and manager E.E. Althouse, who was a member and longtime consistory man here at St. Paul's. Albert was also on consistory, joining as a deacon in 1926 and retiring as an elder in 1964. After the Poultry Item closed sometime around 1940, Albert purchased Labelcraft Press in Percy and continued his printing career there, which included various printing for St. Paul's until he retired. He sold the business in 1972, but Labelcraft still exists, located in the same building on 4th Street in Percy. Albert was also involved musically at St. Paul's, but we'll come back to that shortly.
In April 1931, Albert and Catherine welcomed a baby son, Donald, joining big brother and sister Bob and Mary Gilkison, 13 and 11 years his senior. And here we have a few family photos of Donald and his parents, and Donald being held by his father with his big sister and big brother, Mary and Bob Gilkison. And there is Donald in the front with his parents and Catherine's parents, the Cookers. Along with Grandpa and Grammy Cooker, all 7 lived at the High Street home a block away from St. Paul's. For those of you who may be getting confused, Donald was my father. Just like the Ziegenfuss family was growing, St. Paul's was also growing at this time, and one of the most visible areas of growth was in music ministry. The home on High Street was full of music. Catherine played piano and sang alto in the church choir. Albert played violin and sang tenor in the church choir. Bob was an excellent cornet player, and he was a part of the group of instrumentalists under the leadership of Fritz Kemmerer, who first played hymns from the bell tower at 5 a.m. on Easter mornings in the 1930s. Bob also played solos in Sunday school and church over the years. He joined the band at the age of, he joined the Quakertown band at the age of 16 and remained a member of that organization until age 76, a remarkable 60-year tenure. He also sang in the church choir on and off throughout the years. His sister Mary was an especially gifted musician. She was a student of J. Edward Moyer, who was St. Paul's choir director and organist, as well as a music teacher in the Sellersville School. Mary sang and as a teen played baritone horn, but where she shined was on the keyboard, both piano and organ. At Mr. Moyer's urging, after graduation from Selkirk High, Mary attended Westminster Choir College in Princeton, New Jersey, with a double major in piano and organ. During her years at Westminster, she regularly continued her involvement at St. Paul's and often would bring classmates with her to perform solos and recitals. During her senior year at Westminster in 1938, Mr. Moyer resigned his positions here at St. Paul's, and Mary was appointed to replace him in the roles of organist and choir director. During this time, choir rehearsals were moved to Friday nights to accommodate her academic responsibilities during the week in Princeton. The choir was already well established and continued to flourish under her direction. And at that time, she didn't direct, but she accompanied the junior choir. The junior choir was actually under the direction of Reverend Shepley, and her younger brother, Donald, was a member of the junior choir. And here we have a picture from about 1939 of St. Paul's Junior Choir. In the red box is my dad, Donald. Next to him is Jerry Sheets. I think Jerry's here this evening. And Jerry, there she is. Jerry, there you are in the junior choir in 1939, and I'm happy to say Jerry's still a member of the choir. Hopefully, if we start up in September again, she'll still come out and sing with us. And then Reverend Shepley is in the back, was the director of the group, and that's my Aunt Mary to the right in the white robe who accompanied the junior choir. Sorry, I lost my spot. She carried out these positions at St. Paul's for just about a year. After receiving her degree from Westminster Choir College, she accepted a position as minister of music for a very large congregational church in Naugatuck, Connecticut. She remained in Connecticut for the remainder of her 97 years, but did visit Sellersville and St. Paul's as often as possible. Just a couple of years after Mary's departure, Albert, my grandfather, became choir director in 1943 and remained in that position for 21 years. He had experience singing not only with St. Paul's Choir, but also with the North Pensman Chorus and Quartet. St. Paul's Choir was in its heyday under Albert's direction. Along with regular Sunday services that often included 2 anthems, many cantatas and special musical performances were prepared and performed each year, earning St. Paul's Choir wide acclaim in the Upper Bucks area. And here we have a picture of the choir from 1958. In this picture, we won't point them all out, but my grandmother's in that picture. Both of my grandfathers are in this picture. My dad is in that picture, my Uncle Bob. I believe that's Jean Gaiman in the front left. Is that you, Jean, in the front left? Yes, I see her shaking her head. And there's Jimmy Francis in the back there somewhere. So there are lots of familiar faces to many of us. The choir was also a social organization with annual dinners and parties, as well as get-togethers with various members who were all good friends. As was mentioned in one of our recent e-bites, the choir even produced a record recorded at a special service here at St. Paul's in conjunction with the Quakertown Band. So some of you that are on our email e-blast list, you have seen this, but that's a picture of the record album. And this was a picture that we found of my grandfather dressed in tails to direct that concert that evening. That was him preparing at home at High Street before he came out here to direct that concert that was turned into a record album. Another unique experience for the choir during this time was several exchange trips where the St. Paul's Choir would visit Mary Gilkison, now Mary McClary, and her choir at her church in Connecticut. Likewise, their choir from Connecticut on occasion would take a road trip and visit and sing here at St. Paul's. While there were many good and happy times in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, there were sad times too where St. Paul's supported and consoled the family. Jacob Cooker died August 1st, 1948. Jacob had been mayor of Sellersville until 1944, when he was 80 years old and voted out of office after successfully leading Sellersville through the Great Depression and World War II. He died within a week of his friend and pastor, Reverend Shepley. The same minister, Reverend Wilbur Trexler, performed both of their funeral services at St. Paul's. Jacob's wife, Mary Cooker, died 3 years later in 1951, a month shy of her 87th birthday. Catherine Ziegenfuss had various health problems over the years, and she died from a stroke in 1959 at the relatively young age of 65.
Switching back to the Ruth side of the family, as we mentioned, Preston was an active leader of St. Paul's. His son Lamar, my great-grandfather, was a graduate of Sellersville High School and then attended Temple University for 1 year. However, the family did not have the finances for him to continue higher education, and he joined the working world, getting a sales job for Pennsylvania Power and Light, commonly referred to as PP&L. He remained with PP&L his entire working life until retirement. He also remained in the family home on Temple Avenue, helping support his parents, Preston and Annie. Lamar married Minnie Ruth in 1939, but there are a few side notes to add to that story. Minnie, my great-grandmother, is my dad's one grandparent who was not raised here at St. Paul's. She grew up in Lansdale, and her parents went to two separate churches. However, she, for the most part, attended her mother's church, Leidy's Reformed. Lamar and Minnie dated for 13 years before they got married, in large part due to obligations they had at their respective homes, helping support their parents during the Depression. Minnie's father, Charles Riebel, was a detective for the Reading Railroad until he was run over by a train and died in a suspicious accident in a rail yard in Philadelphia. This left Minnie as the sole support for her mother, Ella, who was not well to begin with, and Minnie's sister, who was 11 years younger and stayed home to care for their mother. When her mother died in 1938, plans were made for both her and her sister to get married. The sisters were married on the same day, but in separate churches, or I should say separate services, not separate churches, at Trinity Reformed Church in Telford. Reverend Spots was the minister at both Leidy's and Trinity, and they had the ceremony at Trinity so that people could easily take the trolley to the wedding. And there's a picture of their wedding invitation up on the screen. Reverend Spots officiated the marriage of Ruth Riebel and Walter Rausch in the morning, and then he officiated with Reverend Shepley assisting the marriage of Minnie Riebel and Lamar Ruth in the afternoon. The Riebel home in Lansdale was sold, and Minnie moved into the Temple Avenue home with her new husband and in-laws. She began attending St. Paul's at that time also. Interestingly, her new neighbor was her husband's boss, who did not think that women should drive, and after years of being an independent woman who drove regularly, she was a good wife and never drove again. 2 years into their marriage, Lamar and Minnie welcomed what would be their only child, a daughter, Mary, my grandmother. Mary was baptized by Reverend Shepley on the evening of Christmas Day, 1941, weeks after the attack on Pearl Harbor and the United States entry into World War II. The date was chosen because family was in town for Christmas dinner. It was a small service with just family members present, but Mrs. Shepley, the church's organist at the time, felt there should be music and played the organ for the family during the service. The Ruth family remained active at St. Paul's, which again was literally in the family's backyard. As a young girl, Mary enjoyed lying in bed and looking out her bedroom window at St. Paul's Good Shepherd stained glass window. This window is now to my right in the choir loft, but during her childhood and prior to the church's 1959 addition, it was located on the back wall of Fretz Hall, easily visible from the rear of the Ruth home. Mary also enjoyed playing on the church's back lawn where the church addition now stands with Reverend Bill Meyer's children, Freddie and Suzanne. She remembers how beautiful the back of the church was, which matched the front perfectly and had a tiered lawn with well-kept shrubbery. She and the other children living on Walnut Street and Temple Avenue walked through the church's yard every day on their way to and from school, which is now the Sellersville Museum and Borough Hall buildings. Annie Ruth, her grandmother, died when Mary was quite young in 1944, but she, however, had the real joy of having her grandfather Preston into her high school years until he died at the age of 83 in 1958. Lamar followed in his father's footsteps and was a consistent member for many years, including during the building campaign for the 1959 edition, during which time he served as secretary. He also sang in the church choir periodically, although he didn't stick with it in part due to ongoing heart problems which started in his 40s. He was also a civic leader and was very involved with the Sellersville's Park and Recreation Board, he was integral in having the bike path installed in Lenape Park. He was posthumously recognized for his service to the Parks Board with a plaque that is in the field near the tennis courts at Druckenmiller Playground, a picture of which is up on the screen.
Donald Ziegenfuss and Mary Ruth both grew up at St. Paul's, although Donald was 10 years older. Like his family members, Donald was musically inclined and was active in music at the church. Along with his participation in junior choir, his father also had him sing in a quartet at church with some regularity. Along with Donald, the quartet was made up of his best friend, Carol Gantz, who would grow up and become the inventor of the Dustbuster when he worked for Black & Decker, his cousin Shirley Wolfe, and Lois Plore, who would become Lois Frankenfield. We couldn't find a picture of the quartet, but we did find after the quartet, that's a picture of Shirley and Lois when in their younger years, probably during the same time period when the quartet would have been performing regularly. Donald did very well academically and was salutatorian of the Selkirk class of 1949. He attended Franklin and Marshall College in Lancaster, which at the time was very connected to the Reformed Church. After just 2 years at F&M, he took the exams to enter dental school and did well enough to earn early acceptance at Temple Dental School in Philadelphia, where he spent his next 4 years. He was awarded his Doctor of Dental Surgery in 1955 and then enlisted in the U.S. Army. After basic training at Fort Sam Houston in Texas, he spent the rest of his 2-year enlistment in the Army Dental Corps stationed at Walter Reed Army Hospital in Washington, D.C. He was honorably discharged from the Army as a captain in 1957. After a road trip around the country with his parents, he started his own dental practice at the house on High Street in 1957. Mary Ruth attended St. Paul's regularly with her family also. Outside of school and church, she had an active interest in art. She took lessons, painted, and drew regularly. To help pay for her supplies, she had jobs babysitting for local families, including for Doc and Nancy Lyons, who on more than one occasion took her on their family vacation so that Mom could help keep an eye on their kids while Doc voraciously read and studied his medical texts. She also ran errands for locally acclaimed artist Walter Baum. Following graduation from Penridge High School in 1959, Mary attended Moore College of Art in Philadelphia. During the week, she lived in the city with her Aunt Janice and Uncle Howard, but took the train home to Sellersville every weekend. During her college years, Mary made attempts to make sure that a certain choir member, who also happened to now be her dentist, would take notice of her. Among other things, she joined the choir one summer, although her time there was short-lived because her mother, Minnie, told her she didn't have much of a singing voice. Parenting has changed in the years since then. We don't think that's true, but it's something that sticks in her mind to this day, I can say. Whatever else she did to gain his attention, it must have worked. Donald was to attend a Lions Club dance with his father, Albert, and his soon-to-be new wife, Gladys, along with Penridge High School principal, Dr. Keim, and his wife. I think there was some pressure for Donald to bring a date. Apparently, as he was sitting in the choir loft one Sunday morning, he looked down into the congregation and took notice of a certain young woman who he had seen around St. Paul's for years. As he was going upstairs to bed one night, Donald said to his father, "I think I might ask Mary Ruth to go to the dance." He did ask, and she accepted. The first date was a bit daunting for Mary, as it was a triple date with what would be her future in-laws and her former high school principal. But things did go more easily from then on. I don't know if she's here tonight, but from a brief conversation we had with Ellen Clark a few weeks ago, she apparently is the person to ask if you want the details of some of Mary and Donald's dates, because she said she had a good view of the Ruth home from her apartment on Temple Avenue. So sometimes her Friday or Saturday evening entertainment while her husband was at work to look out the window and see what Mom and Dad were doing at the Ruth house. So I'll let her finish those stories. I'm not sure I want to know. Lamar and Minnie had some hesitation about their daughter dating and marrying a man 10 years her senior, but did give permission and were very happy when Donald and Mary were married on August 24th, 1963. And that is a picture of my grandparents, my mom's parents, on my mom and dad's wedding day. The wedding was big news, and it even made it into the sports section of the News Herald. There was a softball tournament at the playground that weekend, and it was noted in the paper that Reverend Bill Meyer attended their wedding rehearsal in the, quote, the full green and white battle dress of the church's team, unquote, so that he could go from the rehearsal directly to a late Friday night game where he hit a 2-run double. On Saturday at noon, he played another game and then took time off to perform my parents' wedding ceremony before later playing yet another game. Also noted in the sports section was that Dr. Harley Hunsicker, the podiatrist from Percy, was a soloist at the wedding and noted Reverend Bill Meyer limping, and thus retrieved some Novocaine from his office and injected it into the pastor's foot to get him through the second game later on Saturday. There was also a traditional wedding announcement outside of the sports section, but that wasn't as interesting, so we presented this. And here are some photos from my parents' wedding here in the sanctuary. So my parents, of course, kneeling in the front, and Reverend Bill Meyer, my Uncle Bob, my dad's brother, was the best man. And there are the happy couple in the middle there with my mom's parents, Lamar and Minnie, to the left, and then on the right is my dad's dad, Albert, and his second wife, Gladys Ziegenfuss, and they had been married in 1961. I'm sorry, I lost my place. The service was in the sanctuary. The reception was supposed to be in the backyard of the Ruth home directly behind the house, or behind the church. However, after having not rained for weeks, it rained just enough on their wedding day to move the reception into Fellowship Hall here at church. So there's the wedding party down in Fellowship Hall for the reception, and also in Fellowship Hall, Mom and Dad cutting their wedding cake. Mary had just graduated from Moore College of Art, earning a Bachelor's of Fine Arts in Interior Design, the first in her family to graduate from college, and she had done very well there. She won a fellowship to travel to Europe and study art there. So, Donald temporarily closed his practice, and the two honeymooned for 3 months traveling throughout Europe. When they returned to Sellersville, Mary moved into the High Street home with Donald, who for the 2 years prior to that had lived there alone. Mary and Donald continued in their parents' and grandparents' footsteps and remained active in the community and in the life of the congregation here at St. Paul's once they were married and started a family of their own. Donald kept busy running his dental practice out of the High Street home, but also found time for Lions Club, Masons, and served terms on the Penridge School Board, serving as its treasurer at the time when the upper building of the high school was built. At church, Donald remained active in the choir, not only singing, but also used his piano playing skills to warm up the choir on Sunday mornings, because in those years, Bob Swartz often played more than 20 minutes of prelude music. He also played piano with the Sunday school orchestra that played hymns at the beginning of the Sunday school hour. Both Donald and Mary were on the music committee for many years and consistory at different times through the years. As a young woman, newly married, and with the somewhat then, at that time, unique experience of having attended college in Philadelphia for 4 years, Mary shared some of her newfound ideas about women in leadership. Recognizing the large role that the Women's Guild played in the vibrant life of St. Paul's, she felt it was wrong to prohibit those women from being on consistory and having a voice in the decisions of the church. As such, she wrote letters to the all-male consistory asking that women be allowed to be elected to join. At the time, she felt her requests fell on deaf ears, but by the end of the 1960s, women were, for the first time in its history, a part of consistory. At the town level, Mary served on the Sellersville Planning Commission for many years. When it was decided to move the War Memorial from the Five Points intersection into Lenape Park, she designed the new expanded memorial, incorporating a stage area and flagpoles for state, town, and service flags that are flown on special occasions and holidays, pictured on the screen there. Their first child, Peter, was born in July 1965. Daughter Mary Beth was born 4 years later in June of 1969. And finally, surprising many, I was born several years later in December 1974. All three children, like their parents, were baptized, confirmed, and attended Sunday school here at St. Paul's, still like previous generations, walking out Green Street from the High Street home to do so. So those are pictures from my baptism in April 1975. The picture on the right, of course, is the family of 5 of us, and then the left with Reverend Bill Meyer holding me. Mary was on consistory in the mid-70s when it was decided to renovate the sanctuary. She applied her education in interior design to the project, with some of her suggestions coming to fruition and others not. Not happy with the carpet samples that consistory was considering, she went out on her own and hunted down the carpet that is still adhered to this space today. She was pleased to find a high-quality carpet that would wear well and negotiated a reasonable price based on the large square footage needed for this room. She also selected the paint colors for the room, although the walls are not the color she chose due to a last-minute and private intervention by Reverend Bill Meyer with the painters as they were about to begin. The walls should be, according to Mary, a pale blue to coordinate with the blue ceiling. Reverend Bill Meyer apparently thought the walls should be an even paler shade with a touch of green that some might say doesn't match the ceiling quite the way it should. Mary holds many fond memories from Reverend Bill Meyer. However, we gathered during our preparation for this evening that not all memories are sunshine and roses. So here we have some photos from, this is before this room looked like it is now. So that was the previous pew configuration and the blue carpet that was in the room at the time. And I think the walls were white then and before the narthex was closed in. And then also an advantage of living close to the church, you're aware of when the truck comes to deliver the pews. So there are some pictures being taken of the pews you're sitting in tonight being unloaded from the truck and installed in the sanctuary. Having said that, Mary also wasn't keen on changing the configuration of the seating to include a center aisle. If anyone would like to know, I'm sure she would be happy to tell you what the pew arrangement ought to be in a sanctuary of this shape in a Gothic-style building. Mary was asked to help on other occasions too. During the Got Vision campaign, she chose and was not overruled on the colors for the social hall, parlor, and choir room walls and flooring, and she, along with Pastor Patty, chose the furniture for the parlor. Most recently, at her daughter's request, she assisted in choosing the new front doors of the church. Also in the 70s, Mary was the chairperson for the last iteration of St. Paul's Pageant of the Brides, which was in 1979. As a young girl, she had attended the 1950s era pageant, and she had some ideas about having another pageant, and before she knew it, she was put in charge of the event. She planned and worked for about 6 months to put the program together. In the end, it was a huge success and sold as many seats as they could and filled the whole church. We have pictures from that event that we hope to share in the coming months. It was just too much to add into tonight.
With the family's long involvement with music at St. Paul's, Donald and Mary were called upon when Robert Brown, who lived on Wirt Avenue, died and left money to the church specifically for the purchase of handbells. No one at St. Paul's knew much of anything about handbells except for Donald. His sister, who we've talked about before, Mary Gilkison McClary, had added to her Connecticut church's music ministries in addition to traditional vocal choirs by having a handbell choir. Mary had distinguished herself across the country as a composer of handbell music and through her involvement in the American Guild of English Handbell Ringers, eventually serving as its national president and traveling not only across the country but around the world directing handbell festivals. By default, Donald was asked to lead this new music ministry at St. Paul's. At his sister's suggestion, our first 3.5 octaves of handbells were purchased locally from Sellersville's own Schulmerich Bells. Donald and his wife Mary shared leadership of our bell choir in its earliest years. 1980, around the time the bell choir was being developed, was a difficult year for the Ziegenfuss family. Albert, age 78, who had spent his retirement years living in the Poconos, died rather unexpectedly. Albert's sister, Florence Wolfe, died 1 month later. Donald's good friend, Ralph Waite, who was a member of St. Paul's, also passed away. And it was in the fall of 1980 when people started noticing that Donald was walking with a limp that he couldn't explain. The limp didn't go away, and his walking began to slowly deteriorate, needing a cane to get around. After a couple of years of unanswered questions, doctors finally diagnosed him with a form of ALS, commonly known as Lou Gehrig's disease. Through these struggles, Donald remained active at church, making accommodations as needed. As walking became slower and more difficult, he stopped processing with the choir and would walk in early to the choir loft on his own. When he could not easily stand unaided, he continued to lead bell rehearsal seated, but taught Mary to conduct so that she could lead the group in Sunday performances. Eventually, he could no longer actively participate, but his church family did not forget about him. As the condition progressed, he first lost use of his legs, then later his arms and hands, forcing him to sell his dentistry practice in 1985. In May of 1985, his diaphragm atrophied to the point where he could no longer breathe on his own. After a scary encounter with death at his home on a Saturday morning, he was rushed to Grandview Hospital, where he was placed on a ventilator. The doctors quickly determined he would depend on it for the rest of his life. During this time, the only way for Donald to leave his home was if Mary and Peter would lift him in his wheelchair down the front steps of their house, coming out the front entrance through the dentist office. There was a ramp on Jim Francis' home from when he had cared for his sister-in-law. Jim and others from the church thought that the ramp would do more good for Donald, and several men of the church worked to remove it from Jim's house, transport it across town, and attach it to the side deck of the High Street home. Pete also fashioned a small ramp so Donald could be wheeled out the living room sliding glass door onto the deck and rolled around the deck to the ramp, which led to the side yard near the front of the house. Donald was in the hospital for close to a month when he first went on the ventilator, and then it took time for the family to adapt to the around-the-clock care he needed as one of the area's first patients to go home on a ventilator. When he did leave the house, Donald's first outing was to go to St. Paul's. Family friend and former choir director, Rudy Lucenti, helped the family. He was working at a nursing home at the time and had access to an extra ventilator that he brought along just in case. Although the first outing to the trip went well, which is pictured up here on the screen, it wasn't practical to do it regularly, as it took well over an hour to get Donald ready, transported out the street, and into the church. Since he could no longer go to church regularly, the church on occasion came to him. Jimmy France visited regularly and even stayed with him on occasion so Mary could run out for errands. One of Donald's biggest joys was when the choir would come and rehearse at the house and visit. They would do this at least once a year, sometimes more, for the almost 5 years that Donald was on the ventilator and still living at home. They continued this in later years when Donald was in Grandview Hospital Skilled Nursing Unit, where he spent the last 4 years of his life until he passed away in January 1994. Once again, the younger generation followed in the footsteps of earlier generations. After Donald and Mary stepped down from directing the bell choir, Carol Palermo was hired to lead the group. When she resigned the position several years later, she recommended Pete to be considered to take over. He wasn't so sure about that, but after some persuasion from Gene Souter-Gaiman, he decided to try it out and see for a little bit and see how it would go. Pete has now been the bell choir director so long that he can't remember when asked what year he started. He is also the church's longest tenured member of staff. We did some research, and it appears that he started this endeavor 33 years ago in 1988. And here we have a picture of a Facebook post that he made from the very last bell choir rehearsal before the pandemic set in. Pete has also been playing trumpet at St. Paul's on special occasions for the better part of 40 years. He played trumpet in Sojourn, which was a music ministry that was based at St. Paul's, started by Kevin Weichel, that performed concerts throughout southeastern PA. Pete's brother and sister-in-law, Chris and Nancy, played trombone and flute in Sojourn also. Mary Beth got involved in mission work through the urging of Nancy Lyons. Mary Beth went to the Millennium celebration of the Russian Orthodox Church with the National Council of Churches in 1988. It was during their first visit to what was then the Soviet Union that she obtained the contact information for Andrei Petrov, literally on a scrap of paper pushed through a vent on a bus window. When she returned home, Mary Beth began writing letters to Andre, who along with his friend Paul visited us here at St. Paul's in 1991. St. Paul supported Andre's early ministry in Russia. Andre continues to this day to have a thriving ministry, and you can listen to his live webcast on Facebook every Friday morning, that is, if you understand Russian. Mary Beth returned to Russia in 2004 to work in the orphanage in Demidov and continues to stay in touch with Andre. Mary Beth married Rich Beringer here at St. Paul's in 1994. In family tradition, she has also served on consistory and was appointed to work with Buster Guth on the new front door project a few years ago. Being the youngest of 3 children, Chris often did whatever his big brother and sister had done. So it was a surprise to him when he was asked to join consistory in 2002, something his siblings had not done up to that point. Almost immediately upon joining consistory, he was tasked with forming the group that would research buying a new organ, a process that took about a year from start to finish. He also served as the vice president and president of consistory as his term progressed. He was involved with starting the Got Vision campaign and also with the sad task of finding a new organist for the first time in 50 years upon Bob Swartz's passing. Chris resigned from consistory when he became the choir director in September 2006, church policies having changed since the days when his grandfather Albert served many consecutive years both as a consistory member and a choir director. And here we have 2 pictures of both the past and future St. Paul's choir directors.
Well, and that actually brings us pretty close to the present, where we now have the 5th generation of the family participating in the life of the congregation. Preston, Jocelyn, and Simon Ziegenfuss, along with their cousin Jacob Beringer, are familiar faces here, ready to use their gifts to continue the ministry of St. Paul's in the Sellersville area. It's not just our family's general dislike of change that has kept us in this area for so many years. Well, that plays a part. One of the main reasons for our family's long history here in Sellersville area is our connection to St. Paul's. As you have heard tonight, over the past 150 years, our family has been involved with other activities, organizations, and groups, such as Kiwanis Club, Lions Club, different choruses and bands, various civic boards, etc. But the one constant through the generations is St. Paul's. Our family is not one to go around quoting Bible verses, but having this center of Christian faith is core to who we are. In this day and age, many people unfortunately don't understand the assurances that can only be found in faith in Christ. It's hard for me to explain if asked, why do I faithfully attend St. Paul's? For me, it's as silly as being asked, why do you take your right foot with you everywhere you go? Well, first of all, it's a part of me. And besides that, it helps me stand, it helps me walk, and if I encounter an obstacle in my path, I can use it to kick it out of the way. During the discussion Preston had with my mom in preparation for this evening, she summed up the family sentiments towards this church quite well when she said, "What you need to understand is that St. Paul's really was and still is an extension of our family." Members of our church family here at St. Paul's have said to us how much our family has done for the church over the years. In reality, the church has done even more for us, even more than we could ever pay in return. Our family is grateful to St. Paul's for all the ministries of this church over the past 150 years, and we're glad to be a part of this celebration. So with that, we say thank you to everyone for coming out tonight. We invite you to visit Fretz Hall, where we have all kinds of pictures and family artifacts on display. I will say that a lot of them are really, really old, so we do ask that you don't touch them. And Preston and I will be over there to try and answer any questions you have, and thank you again for coming out tonight.